Welcome, the Lord's chosen. There is a universal law people never take seriously until it starts collecting receipts. Most people think consequences are loud, explosive, immediate. They think if life is going to punish someone, it shows up like a public spectacle with alarms, chaos, and instant karma. That's a lie we've been sold to make us impatient. Real consequences are quieter, slower, and far more surgical. They don't announce themselves. They wait. They observe. And when they finally move, they don't miss. Here's a fact people don't like admitting. The human brain is wired to underestimate delayed consequences. Psychologists call it temporal discounting. In simple terms, people genuinely believe that if nothing bad happened right away, then nothing ever will. That's why folks get bold with disrespect. That's why they keep poking, provoking, crossing lines, and doing too much. Their logic is simple. If I got away with it yesterday, I'll get away with it tomorrow. History, however, has never agreed with that mindset. This is where the story usually gets interesting. And a little funny if we're being honest. Because there's always that moment when life stops laughing with them and starts laughing at them. Bills show up with attitudes. Friendships start malfunctioning. Opportunities begin ghosting them like a bad date. And suddenly, the same people who were loud, reckless, and untouchable are whispering, confused and exhausted, wondering when things started going left. What makes this situation hit harder is that none of it feels random. The downfall doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere very specific, from the decision to bother someone they should have left alone. Not because you were threatening, not because you were dramatic, but because you were stable, observant, and not playing the same sloppy game they were playing. And that combination tends to trigger consequences that don't rush. They arrive on schedule. So if you've been watching life slowly, line people up and deal with them one by one, this isn't about revenge, ego, or superiority. It's about balance correcting itself. And trust me, balance has a sense of humor too. Number one, they thought you were a safe target because you didn't react like them. They sized you up wrong from the very beginning. You didn't shout, didn't swing back emotionally, didn't scramble to defend yourself every time something slick or disrespectful came your way. To people who live off noise and chaos, that looks like weakness. In their minds, power always has to be loud. Control always has to be obvious. So when you stayed calm, observant, and steady, they assumed you were easy. They assumed you wouldn't do anything, and that assumption gave them confidence they never earned. What they didn't understand is that not reacting is often a sign of depth, not fear. You weren't frozen. You were processing. You were clocking patterns, timing, and intent, while they were busy chasing the feeling of winning a moment. They lived for instant reactions because that's all they knew how to manage. You were thinking long-term, whether consciously or not. People like that always overplay their hand. Once they think someone won't push back, they push harder. Jokes turn sharper. Boundaries get tested. Respect slowly disappears. They start saying things they shouldn't say and doing things they wouldn't dare do with someone they actually respect. That's when the real exposure happens. Not because you forced it, but because they revealed themselves without resistance. And here's the part that stings for them later. You never had to change who you were. You didn't become cruel. You didn't get sloppy. You didn't lose control. You simply kept being you while they kept escalating. That contrast matters. Life pays attention to contrast. By the time consequences show up, they're usually confused. In their mind, you were quiet, too calm, too passive. What they didn't see was that restraint gave you clarity, and clarity always outlasts impulse. You walked away clean. They stayed behind with the mess they created, now forced to deal with it without you absorbing the impact. They thought you were safe to target because you didn't react like them. What they learned too late is that people who don't react emotionally tend to react correctly, and life backs that every single time. Number 2, they didn't realize you were the only thing holding their reality together. Some people survive on illusion, and the worst part is they don't even know it. They think their world is steady, organized, and in control, when in reality it's barely functioning. They rely on others to stabilize it for them, to smooth over the chaos, cover the mistakes, absorb the consequences, and make everything appear normal. And you? You were that silent force, keeping them from completely unraveling. They didn't see it because stability is quiet, invisible, and often taken for granted. But your presence was the glue holding their fragile reality together, whether they admitted it or not. When they attacked you, dismissed you, or tried to tear you down, they were poking at the one thing that actually kept their world upright. They thought they could manipulate, overpower, or sideline you without consequences. What they failed to realize is that the moment you step back or disappear, their world doesn't just wobble, it collapses. Bills they ignored become emergencies, relationships they neglected start falling apart, and opportunities they assumed were guaranteed vanish because the silent system they depended on is gone. You weren't loud, dramatic, or in their face, which made your influence invisible to them. They didn't notice the countless ways you managed situations, filled gaps, and absorbed pressure that would have crushed them. And because they never noticed, they never respected it. That invisibility is what made your eventual absence so devastating. Life doesn't punish you for leaving, but it always ensures that people who depended on you feel the weight of their own negligence. They thought they were untouchable because you never demanded recognition. They assumed stability was their birthright. What they didn't realize is that stability has a cost, and when the person paying it leaves, the consequences hit with precision. One by one, their systems start failing, and suddenly they're forced to face what they always ignored, that they never really had control, and their reality was only functioning because of you. Life doesn't miss what's absent. It exposes what was ignored, and that exposure can be brutal. Number 3, they confused access with entitlement. They believed that because they had access to you, your energy, your patience, and your time, they somehow owned it. They acted as if proximity automatically granted them rights, like knowing you meant controlling you, taking from you, or using you whenever it suited them. They didn't see the effort, the restraint, or the self-control that went into interacting with them without exploding. To them, what was freely given looked like weakness, and weakness is meant to be exploited, or so they thought. The problem with entitlement is that it blinds people to reality. They don't see limits until they hit them, and they rarely respect boundaries they never believed were necessary. You didn't broadcast your value. You didn't demand acknowledgement. You just existed, offering what you chose to offer. But in their eyes, your calm, measured presence was a license to overstep, to push harder, and to take more than they deserved. And in doing so, they underestimated the one principle they couldn't manipulate. Life always notices imbalance. Because entitlement is blind, they couldn't recognize that your patience was finite. They assumed it was infinite, that your generosity had no expiry date, and that your silence meant consent. Meanwhile, every slight, every overreach, and every assumption added invisible weight that they didn't see piling up against them. The very thing they treated as a guarantee was quietly building consequences, and every day they acted like they owned you. They were writing their own undoing. When you finally withdrew, it wasn't dramatic. There were no threats, no speeches, no public reveal. You simply stopped being available for their abuse, and suddenly the illusion shattered. They discovered that access does not equal entitlement, that being present doesn't mean being theirs, and that the life they were taking for granted had a natural mechanism to correct their greed. The weight of their assumptions hit all at once, and the chaos they ignored for so long began unfolding precisely because they didn't respect the one person who had quietly kept their world in check. They confused access with entitlement, and in that confusion, they set the stage for consequences they never saw coming, but deserved fully. Number 4, they attacked what they could never replicate. They spent years trying to break you, trying to twist, manipulate, and diminish what they could never understand. Every insult, every slight, every underhanded move was aimed at something unique, something that wasn't theirs to touch. They thought they could replicate your strength, your calm, your clarity, or your moral compass by copying behaviors, mimicking reactions, or bending situations to their favor. But uniqueness isn't earned through imitation or malice. It's built in ways that can't be stolen, forced, or duplicated. And that's what made them dangerous to themselves long before life got involved. People who attack originality rarely recognize it. They think if they throw enough pressure, enough chaos, enough venom, they can crack it open and somehow make it theirs. They fail to understand that what they're attacking isn't fragile. It's designed to endure. Every attempt to damage you only highlighted their lack, their gaps, and their inability to produce anything of comparable substance. Your resilience, your integrity, your calm in the face of their manipulation, all of it was beyond their capacity, and that realization burns quietly when life starts tipping the scales. The cruel irony is that their attacks, intended to diminish you, often magnify your presence. Each time they tried to replicate your essence, they exposed the difference. Every action meant to weaken you became a mirror, reflecting their own limitations. Life notices that. Life rewards depth that cannot be duplicated, and it gradually dismantles shallow constructs that attempt to overshadow it. In the end, they realized too late that what they tried to destroy was indestructible by design. They assumed proximity and aggression could rewrite reality, but all they did was accelerate the unveiling of their own failures. What they attacked could never be replicated, and the more they tried, the clearer it became that the real loss was theirs, not yours. Life has a way of balancing things, and when someone messes with something they can't replicate, consequences don't just follow, they arrive with precision. The chaos they invited wasn't random, it was inevitable. Number 5, they thought you were replaceable because you didn't advertise your value. They made the fatal mistake of believing that because you didn't announce yourself, because you didn't broadcast every achievement or flaunt every ounce of your capability, you were replaceable. To them, visibility equals worth, noise equals impact, and the quieter someone is, the less they matter. They didn't see the countless ways you carried weight they couldn't handle, solved problems they couldn't recognize, and maintained standards they couldn't even imagine. Your value wasn't a performance, it was a presence, and that presence operated silently, efficiently, and profoundly. People who underestimate others like this rarely realize that quiet competence is more dangerous than loud chaos. While they were busy trying to prove themselves or force control, you were moving through life with an invisible precision, stabilizing situations, navigating complexities, and ensuring things ran smoothly, all without needing recognition. And that invisibility is what made their eventual shock so brutal. They assumed someone else could fill your space, replicate your decisions, and absorb the same pressures, not knowing that your value was bespoke, tailored, and impossible to duplicate. When you finally stepped back or removed yourself entirely, The impact was immediate and undeniable. Systems they relied on began cracking, small issues became big crises, and people who thought they had everything under control suddenly realized they were scrambling without a safety net. Life doesn't need to rush consequences. It only needs absence, and absence hits hardest when the one who leaves is irreplaceable. The irony is bitter. They spent years assuming they could replace you without consequence, only to discover that their world depended on the very person they dismissed. Their arrogance blinded them to your uniqueness, and their impatience convinced them that silence meant weakness. Life doesn't miss what's obvious. It exposes what was invisible. And in their attempts to minimize you, they overlooked the most important fact. Some people aren't replaceable, and the moment they step away, reality has a way of rearranging itself, often leaving those who underestimated them in ruin. They thought you were replaceable. Life proved they were not ready for the consequences of that assumption. Number 6, they underestimated how much the universe notices motive. They believed that what they did mattered more than why they did it. They thought actions existed in a vacuum, disconnected from intent, and that as long as their moves were clever, manipulative, or sneaky enough, the outcome would always favor them. They didn't realize that the universe, or life itself, doesn't just see what people do. It sees why they do it. Every word, every betrayal, every act of cruelty carries a signature that can't be erased. Motive is louder than action, and when their motives were rotten, the world noticed long before consequences caught up. The truth is brutal. People rarely fall because they made one bad choice. They fall because their choices are rooted in self-interest, envy, greed, or malice. You weren't the target of random bad luck. You were the mirror reflecting the exact energy they were putting into the world. The universe keeps a mental ledger, not of what's done superficially, but of what's done with intent. And theirs was obvious, even if they tried to mask it with charm, excuses, or manipulation. What makes it fascinating is that life doesn't rush. It doesn't need dramatic interventions. It lets motives accumulate, magnifying the consequences until they're undeniable. That friend who betrayed you out of jealousy, the colleague who undermined you out of insecurity, the person who acted cruelly out of control or spite. Life notices all of it. Each act seeds the exact result they deserve, often in ways that are quiet, precise, and unavoidable. Meanwhile, you moved through life without needing to force outcomes, argue over justice, or seek vengeance. You were guided by clarity and integrity. Their energy clashed with the natural order, and the universe doesn't fail when someone's motives are toxic. It balances, slowly, methodically, sometimes painfully, but inevitably. They underestimated how much the universe notices motive, and that underestimation was fatal. They assumed cleverness and aggression would protect them. What they didn't account for is that life has a way of sorting motives like currency, rewarding the honest and exposing the corrupt. One by one it catches up with those who operate in darkness while they think the world is blind. And when it does, there's no arguing, no bargaining, no undoing what's already written in consequence. Number 7, they thought you'd break before you'd detach. They believed that pressure, drama, and manipulation could bend you, that constant pushing would make you crack and beg for mercy. They counted on your endurance being limited, on your patience wearing thin, on your emotions exploding under stress. They thought if they kept pushing hard enough, they'd get the reaction they wanted, a show of weakness, anger, or dependency. What they failed to understand is that breaking isn't always the way you handle pressure. Sometimes detachment is the stronger, deadlier response. You didn't fight on their terms. You didn't play their game. You didn't scramble to prove yourself or justify your worth. You quietly withdrew, untangling yourself from the chaos and emotional hooks they assumed they had. That's a kind of power they couldn't see because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream or retaliate. It's subtle, clean, and undeniable, and it terrifies people who depend on control. Detachment exposes them for what they really are: fragile, reckless, and unprepared for consequences they thought were far away. The irony is brutal. While they were investing energy into pushing you around, they were unknowingly accelerating the moment they would have to face reality alone. Every manipulation, every jab, every attempt to provoke only tightened the rope they were dangling on. You weren't breaking, you were strategically exiting. You weren't losing, you were preserving clarity while their world started unraveling. Detachment isn't passive, it's precise. It forces reflection and creates consequences without a single dramatic scene. The absence of reaction becomes louder than 1,000 arguments, and suddenly everything they relied on, attention, control, influence, disappears. And when that happens, life fills the void. Situations they could have navigated with you suddenly collapse. People they depended on for stability start leaving. Opportunities vanish. Their own chaos, which they assumed you'd absorb indefinitely, comes crashing back. They thought you'd break before you'd detach, and that miscalculation was catastrophic. Detachment is a silent verdict, and once issued, it sets into motion a chain of consequences that no manipulation, apology, or effort can undo. Life doesn't rush, but it never forgets who chose clarity over chaos. Number 8, they kept pushing because you kept surviving. They never understood that your endurance wasn't weakness. It was proof of something they could never replicate. Every time they poked, provoked, or attacked, you didn't crumble. You didn't panic. You didn't lower yourself to their level. You survived. And every survival, every calm response, every moment of quiet resilience offended them more than any argument or confrontation ever could. People like that aren't motivated by respect or understanding. They're motivated by control. When their control fails, their frustration grows, and instead of stopping, they push harder, not realizing that their very persistence is the mechanism that will eventually undo them. Surviving their attacks forced them to confront a reality they couldn't manipulate. They expected reactions that suited their narrative: anger, fear, submission, and when you didn't give it to them, they were confused. Confusion makes people reckless, and recklessness is fertile ground for consequence. Every jab, every lie, every attempt to provoke you only widened the gap between what they assumed and what was actually happening. You were operating on clarity, while they were operating on impulse, and that imbalance is devastating when it finally meets reality. The danger for them wasn't that you fought back. It was that you endured without compromise. Endurance exposes their patterns, highlights their weaknesses, and silently broadcasts the truth of their actions. It's uncomfortable because it forces them to face themselves while thinking they're still in control. And the more they pushed, the faster their own structures began to crack. Bills, relationships, opportunities, and alliances that seemed solid started collapsing because their energy was misdirected and their judgment clouded by obsession with someone who simply refused to break. They kept pushing because you kept surviving, and in doing so, they set the stage for consequences they could never dodge. Life doesn't need to hurry when someone's persistence is destructive. It simply allows the build-up to reach a point where collapse is inevitable. And when it does, every push they ever made comes back on them, amplified by their own miscalculation. They confused survival with weakness, and that misjudgment is what makes downfall so unstoppable. Number 9, they assumed you'd always absorb the damage, They treated you like a sponge, believing that no matter how much they dumped on you, insults, lies, chaos, responsibility, or betrayal, you would just soak it all up without ever breaking, reacting, or walking away. They counted on your endurance being unlimited, your patience being infinite, and your integrity being expendable. They thought that because you tolerated their toxicity for so long, you would continue doing it indefinitely. What they didn't understand is that absorbing damage has a limit, and once that limit is reached, the consequences don't just stop. They come back in ways that are precise, unavoidable, and often devastating. Every attack they made, every slight, every manipulation they thought was harmless, built up like a hidden ledger. You didn't acknowledge it publicly, you didn't confront it in every moment, and that invisibility made them feel untouchable. They assumed silence meant compliance, presence meant submission, and endurance meant weakness. But the truth is that by tolerating them, you were quietly setting the stage for what was inevitable. Their energy, misdirected and unchallenged, accumulated like a pressure cooker, and the longer it went unchecked, the stronger the eventual fallout would be. When you finally stepped back, withdrew, or simply stopped absorbing the chaos, the impact was immediate. Situations that they thought would be managed by your tolerance started collapsing. Their lies couldn't be patched up anymore. Their manipulations had nowhere to land, and the responsibilities they dumped on you began to ricochet directly onto them. What they assumed was a safe game of overstepping boundaries turned into a reckoning. The real irony is that they never realized the strength in what they thought was passivity. Absorbing damage isn't weakness, it's endurance. And endurance builds clarity, strategy, and foresight. And when that tolerance ends, life ensures that every bit of energy they thought they escaped hits them in full. They assumed you'd always absorb the damage, but in reality, you were silently preparing for a moment when they would have to face the weight of their own actions. And that moment arrives without warning, leaving them exposed, unprepared, and fully accountable. Number 10. They didn't understand that some people are protected by design. They assumed life was random, that luck was a coin flip, and that anyone who endured their attacks was simply getting by on chance. What they failed to see is that some people are inherently protected, not because of power, influence, or connections, but because the way they operate, the way they move through the world, naturally shields them from destruction. You weren't dramatic, you weren't loud, and you didn't announce your defenses, which made their attacks feel like they should land. But protection doesn't always look like armor. Sometimes it looks like clarity, strategy, and an unshakable internal balance that makes chaos bounce off instead of sticking. The mistake they made was thinking that absence of reaction meant absence of defense. They assumed their schemes, lies, and manipulations could hit a target that was soft, pliable, or unguarded. They didn't realize that what you carried internally, patience, foresight, and the ability to detach from their chaos, acted as a natural shield. Every time they tried to provoke a collapse, you simply moved past it, unaffected and intact. And every failed attempt emboldened the universe to respond in ways they couldn't anticipate. Protection by design isn't flashy, and it doesn't need validation. It doesn't have to confront attackers head-on or shout warnings. It quietly ensures that attempts to harm are deflected or redirected. And when life intervenes, it doesn't just protect, it enforces balance. People who attacked you for sport, who thought they were clever or untouchable, quickly find that their own structures are vulnerable. Deals fall apart, relationships fracture, and opportunities vanish. The chaos they expected to create in your life becomes chaos in theirs, perfectly calibrated by the very balance they ignored. They didn't understand that some people are protected by design and that ignorance was fatal. They believed that persistence, aggression, and manipulation could outmatch a natural shield they couldn't see. But life doesn't need you to fight to protect you. It simply ensures that when someone built to endure crosses paths with those operating in darkness, the outcome is inevitable. And that outcome, often slow and precise, is unstoppable. Number 11. They tried to rewrite the story while you let truth sit. They assumed they could control perception, manipulate narratives, and twist reality to their advantage. They thought that if they told enough lies, exaggerated enough details, or painted themselves as victims, the truth would become irrelevant. They didn't realize that truth isn't fragile, and it doesn't need constant defense. It doesn't need arguments, evidence, or dramatics to survive. Truth exists quietly, patiently, and relentlessly, and when left alone, it has a way of revealing itself in full force, exposing lies, schemes, and manipulations that seemed untouchable at the moment. By trying to rewrite the story, they revealed their desperation. Every exaggeration, every distorted fact, every act of slander wasn't a sign of strength. It was proof that they feared what the real story would uncover. The more they tried to control perception, the more obvious their tactics became. People notice patterns, even subconsciously. Their lies had edges, inconsistencies, and gaps that truth doesn't have to create. Truth is consistent. Lies require maintenance, and maintenance is exhausting. Eventually, cracks appear, and reality seeps through. Meanwhile, you stayed steady. You didn't chase their narrative, defend yourself at every turn, or waste energy proving innocence in real time. You understood that truth has a timeline, and when the moment is right, it asserts itself without effort. Their attempts to dominate the story only accelerated their exposure. They miscalculated the patience of both life and truth, assuming urgency and noise could overshadow reality. And when truth finally did reveal itself, the impact wasn't gradual. It was undeniable. People began to see their motives, the patterns of manipulation, and the actual events with clarity. Relationships they depended on started faltering. Reputations they cultivated crumbled, and their control evaporated. They couldn't rewrite what reality was already confirming. They tried to rewrite the story while you let truth sit, and that decision became their undoing. They assumed reality could be bent by words, but the universe doesn't operate on scripts. Truth waits, observes, and eventually moves with precision. And when it does, the ones who spent their energy twisting it are always the ones left exposed, unraveling under the weight of what they tried to hide. Number 12. They thought the damage was one-sided. They assumed that only you would feel the weight of their actions, that their manipulation, lies, and attacks would leave you struggling while they remained untouched. They believed that causing chaos in your life was a safe investment, that the fallout would land entirely on your shoulders, and that they would continue walking through life unscathed. That assumption was fatal because they didn't understand how energy works. Every action carries consequences, and harm doesn't just vanish. It travels, accumulates, and eventually returns, often amplified in the exact ways the aggressor fails to anticipate. They poured toxicity into your life as if it were a one-way street, dumping every ounce of their frustration, jealousy, and anger onto someone they assumed was endlessly resilient. What they didn't see was that toxicity has fingerprints. It leaves marks that can't be erased, and it has a way of shaping reality to reveal the patterns behind it. They thought they were untouchable, but the world has a way of balancing scales. The energy they invested in harming you didn't disappear, it redirected. Slowly, almost surgically, life began returning it in forms they couldn't control. Missteps, failed opportunities, broken alliances, financial strain, and the quiet but relentless erosion of stability they always assumed was guaranteed. The irony is sharp. While they focused entirely on your reaction, they ignored the feedback loop they were creating for themselves. Every scheme, every word, every attempt to manipulate you became part of a chain reaction that would eventually land squarely on them. The universe doesn't need to intervene dramatically. It just allows the natural result of one's actions to unfold. And when it does, it's precise, unavoidable, and often more painful than anything they intended for you. They thought the damage was one-sided, and that miscalculation is what makes consequences so devastating. By assuming harm only affected their target, they blinded themselves to the inevitable reality. The energy they poured into chaos was never contained. It always finds a way to return, and when it hits, there's no escape. What they meant for you ends up defining them, exposing them, and dismantling the very life they thought was untouchable. Number 13. They didn't realize walking away was the final verdict. They thought every battle had to be loud, every conflict required confrontation, and every injustice demanded a reaction. They didn't understand that the most powerful decision often comes quietly, the simple act of walking away. You didn't need to scream, argue, or plead for recognition. You didn't need to threaten, retaliate, or force them to see the truth. You just left, and that departure carried a weight they could never have anticipated. Walking away isn't passive, it's decisive, it's final. It removes the leverage they counted on and forces reality to respond without your interference. The moment you exit, everything changes. They suddenly find themselves exposed, operating in a space they assumed was theirs to dominate. All the patterns they relied on, manipulation, pressure, deceit, or control, start unraveling because the person who maintained the balance is gone. It's not punishment delivered by you. It's the natural consequence of removing yourself from a situation they never truly understood. Life fills the gap, and in doing so, it highlights their weaknesses, their miscalculations, and the fragility of their own structures. What makes this so devastating for them is that departure is silent, yet undeniable. There's no performance, no spectacle, no immediate explosion. Just absence. And absence forces reflection, exposure, and often panic. They scramble to regain control over what is now out of reach. The very energy they use to push, manipulate, or dominate you ricochets back into their world. Problems they relied on you to absorb suddenly require their attention, alliances shift, and opportunities they assumed were guaranteed vanish. Walking away isn't about revenge. It's about clarity, self-preservation, and truth. And that clarity is what makes it lethal. They didn't realize that by leaving, you were issuing a final verdict, one that life itself would uphold. Every misstep, every consequence, every collapse that follows isn't arbitrary. It's the natural outcome of someone finally removing themselves from toxicity, revealing that sometimes the quietest action carries the loudest judgment. They were unprepared, and life doesn't forgive unpreparedness. Number 14, they should have left you the fuck alone. Because you were never the one to fight, you were the one to trigger consequences. They made the fatal mistake of thinking you were like everyone else. Someone who reacts, someone who retaliates, someone who plays by their rules. They assumed that conflict was a game you would engage in, that anger could be provoked, and that their attacks would be met with equivalent force. But you were never the one to fight on their level. You didn't escalate, you didn't throw tantrums, and you didn't waste energy trying to prove a point. That's the problem for them. Your silence, your calm, your detachment weren't weaknesses. They were the triggers of something far bigger. The unstoppable, inevitable unfolding of consequences that always follow those who overstep and underestimate the wrong person. Life has a way of correcting imbalance, and it often works through people like you. You were never actively seeking revenge or looking to punish them. Yet your presence alone highlighted their patterns, exposed their flaws, and set in motion events they could never control. The very acts they thought would harm you, manipulation, lies, betrayal, overreach, became the exact fuel life used to dismantle them. You didn't have to chase justice. You didn't have to plead, shout, or prove yourself. You simply existed, and the universe responded to the imbalance they created. The irony is brutal. They were loud, reckless, and confident, attacking someone they assumed would absorb, comply, or falter. Instead, they triggered a chain reaction that left their plans unraveling. Every misstep, every attempt to dominate, every dishonest maneuver they relied on to win became a blueprint for the consequences they now face. They acted as if you were part of the battlefield, when in reality you were the quiet observer holding the line, and their downfall was the inevitable outcome of crossing boundaries they never should have tested. They should have left you the fuck alone, because you were never the one to fight. The moment they crossed the line, the rules changed. You didn't strike, consequences did, and that's what makes it unstoppable, precise, and unavoidable. They learned too late that some people aren't meant to be battled. They are meant to reveal the reckoning that's already on its way. The truth is simple, but few people ever realize it until it's too late. Life doesn't need you to fight to set things right. It doesn't need you to argue, to plead, or to scream for justice. What it does demand is balance, awareness, and clarity. Qualities you carried naturally, silently, and with precision. Every insult they threw, every attempt to manipulate, every overstep and attack wasn't just aimed at you. It was setting the stage for the exact consequences they now face. They mistook your calm for weakness, your presence for compliance, and your patience for endless tolerance. But each of these silent qualities was a force multiplier, a quiet trigger for the unfolding of justice. They underestimated the depth of what you carried. They failed to see that you weren't just surviving, you were enduring strategically, observing carefully, and detaching at exactly the right moments. They assumed access meant entitlement, assumed manipulation meant control, and assumed chaos would break you. Instead, what they did was accelerate the moment they would be exposed. They didn't just attack a person. They poked at the very system that held their reality together, the one quiet force that maintained balance. And now life is forcing them to face exactly what they ignored. From the moment you withdrew, detached, or simply refused to absorb their chaos any longer, the scales began to tip. Life doesn't make mistakes. It has a way of orchestrating consequences that are precise, inevitable, and unstoppable. Every lie they told, every move they tried to control, and every overreach now circles back with interest. What they thought they could manipulate, dominate, or avoid is now falling apart in ways they never anticipated. And it all stems from the one truth they never respected. You were never theirs to control, and life has a way of enforcing that reality. So to everyone watching this, recognize the power of your presence, your restraint, and your clarity. Stand firm in your value, honor your boundaries, and know that when people push too far, life is already lining up to respond. You don't have to fight to win. The universe has your back, and it's far more precise than any revenge could ever be. If this message hit you, if it gave you clarity, or if it reminded you of your own strength, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Like this video, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Every action spreads awareness, and every story told strengthens the message that life doesn't miss what's ignored. It balances it. Stay aware, stay powerful, and watch as the truth unfolds. Stay blessed always.